Good afternoon. I'm Beatrice Galilee, and I'm very happy to be here with Walter Hood, the professor and principal of Hood Design Studio. Walter, how are you? Last time we met, we were in pretty different circumstances down in Australia, and the world seemed a little different back then.
Yeah, we were making choices about architecture, or something like that. Something that seemed really important at the time, right?
I would love to hear a little bit about your personal relationship to landscape and how you came to have this passion and be this leader in your field.
Yeah, I don't think it's an easy geography to chart out. You know, hindsight is 2020. You know, looking back at any career, it's you can kind of stitch together those things that you probably didn't think about when you were younger, starting out. And I'm from the South, so I'm from a state that's about landscape, from North Carolina, and I grew up, in the rural areas as well as the urban areas. And from a very early time, I always had a kind of a recollection of this kind of space around me and what it meant, particularly as a person of color and coming from a rural background. There were lots of, mythologies that my grandparents shared with me, which kind of stuck with me for a long time. And I didn't know that they were latent, that there were these things that would, years later come through and become a different lens in which I could form a practice and an art practice. And so that's, I think, probably the biggest thing. Has a lot to do with just, having elders around you in a space that was full of mythologies. and I use that term broadly because, the mythologies, can help you deal with a lot of different things. And I think for my relatives, going through Jim Crow, going through the segregated South, those mythologies were places where our stories could be preserved. And it gave people, I think, a way to get through the day.
And you've talked about having this sort of two sort of personas a little bit in your work and in the way that you go through the world in public space. Can you talk about a little bit about how you feel in public space now and how, that changed growing up?
Well, it's for anyone who has been, I guess, raised in a context where difference is something that's highly articulated, right? Whether you're female, male, whether it's gender, or whether it's race. And in this particular case, it's race. And, as long as I can remember, there's always been this kind of, existing in the public realm and being aware of yourself. And that kind of freedom that one gets to not become aware of the projection. And that's been something that, very early in my education, I went to an all-Black undergraduate, A&T State University. Very early, writers such as Baldwin, such as Du Bois, those were people who were part of my early education. And so this notion of subjectivity of self was always there, but I just never knew what to do with it, right? Because going through architecture, landscape architecture, race and culture wasn't one of those things that we dealt with in the 80s and early 90s. And so it took me a while to figure out how best to make others aware and myself aware of that doubleness, but also how to exploit it to a point where I didn't feel marginalized all the time. And even today, when I walk into a room, I'm the only person who looks like me. And so still having to navigate that context is, it's just part of the work and it's part of the context in which we live.
Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to talk a little bit about food production. A lot of the news that's, coming through, I mean, there's so much news, first of all, which is just like, it's so intense, but particularly regarding, food production, distribution of food. It seems that the systems that we have, the way that we use industrial agriculture is just, it's becoming, so wasteful. It was already wasteful. It was already something like 25% of all food goes to waste, that's made, certainly in the US. Do you see this, first of all, have you seen sort of come across those same sort of trends in the food production industry? And also, how can we learn from this? Like, are people thinking about, this is not a smart way to use our resources, or we need to be more local, or, what's the sort of reaction from from the professional industry side of it?
Well, I mean, I think, that's a tough question. I mean, because, we are an agrarian society, this colony, right? And very early in the history, there is this agrarian mentality, right? That's still there, but I think I've always had to kind of step back and kind of look at it in its totality, in that, again, I talked about being from a rural culture, being Black, understanding agrarianism through this lens, right? But also understanding capitalism, and what we've created is these systems that, when they break, they really fail. Like right now, I mean, the news is a lot of produce is just basically, they're having to just basically get rid of fields, right? Because there's no one to pick them, there's no place. And so there's major failure at this one scale. But then I always think about, here being in California, we have the Great Central Valley. In Oakland, if you get up every morning at 5 o'clock, you can go downtown, and that's where all the produce comes in. And most people don't have a clue that that's going on there. And so as part of just these systems, we're so separate from these things. And I just find that there's a sense of redundancy that's happening at the small scale, even at the greater scale. Mm-hmm. Where the community gardens, people are advocating that these community gardens are actually feeding neighborhoods, when in reality, they're not, right? Because people are still going to grocery store. I mean, so there are these systems that are just so out of whack to a certain degree. And, maybe at this point, we're going to begin to sort of see how all of these systems are just broken when you have major shutdown. And maybe as we come back and start to sort of think back, coming back, maybe we can begin to make these systems a little bit more hybrid. Mm-hmm. Because I do think when one of these things fail, it's almost like there's no relationship to the other systems. Like, I was just taken by, this one report of this person who was out in the field, just literally just shredding all of the fields. And he was saying, well, if I don't get the yield out in 2 days, I'm going to lose it anyway. I mean, that's no way to kind of think about a system to a certain degree.
No, I mean, it seems that, we had the idea of globalization just doesn't, it's not really, it's not really working if we have that type of inequalities, and all of the inequalities that we knew about before, it seems like they're kind of becoming they're just surfacing now. It's not that we didn't know about it, but they're sort of affecting us maybe more now.
Yeah, I think this idea of the information, though, allowing us to sort of think that we're at this globalized, right, scale, where in reality, a lot of us are still existing at this local level. And I think you see it through this pandemic. It's like those basic services that one needs at the local level are just not even there. And you don't, like, I don't even know where I can go get tested right now. Right, just these simple, basic things. When I even go to the grocery store, it's like, I'm trying to think, okay, well, should there be signage about the produce? Right, I mean, but none of those things are in place, which makes me worry then, is anyone actually looking out, right, for this? Is the FDA or the local government, is anyone basically minding the store at this local level? And it seems to me no one's actually doing it.
And what about your students, and what are the kind of issues that your students and you are thinking about?
I'm finishing up a book on hybrid landscapes, which is trying to articulate a lot of the things that we've been talking about. I use J.B. Jackson's definition of landscape, where he talks about landscapes are those spaces in which humans have chosen to slow down or speed up. And I really love that definition, because if you think in post-colonialism, I mean, this notion of even the colony was put in a place to slow things down, right? And to manifest things. And our infrastructure, a lot of the times, is there to speed up, sometimes to slow down. And so this book is really about how, through making these landscapes, you can see both sides of the coin, and you're not kind of stuck in this post-colonial malaise towards traditionalism or vernacular, but you're really looking at ways in which to think about these new hybrid systems. And a simple idea would be, if you take a kind of a colonial typology like a plaza or a square, you'll see in America by mid-20th century, culturally, we've already hybridized them, because we will refer to them as a plaza park. So there's lots of cities that have plaza parks. And so I'm really diving into, well, how do they get the compound name, and where does that come from? And then how does that relate to what it looks like and how people use it? But that's one that's more rational. And then there's the other side of informal hybrids, which are these new landscapes that come out of a new vocabulary, a vocabulary that's less about a typology, a thing in history, but maybe more about a thing becoming something that's latent in the landscape, like a solar strand. We did a project in Buffalo. It was a strand, a quarter-mile long, but it was all made of solar panels. So really trying to come up with landscapes through this other kind of vein. So that's one thing that I'm writing about. So I'm really kind of frustrated right now, because it's really hard to write about landscape when one can't go in landscape, right? So it's like landscape from afar. But the other work I've been doing with the students is on futures, alternative futures. And we're looking at fiction as a way in which to look at neighborhoods and landscapes where we cannot imagine a different future for. And these are landscapes in which we put the same solutions in over and over and over again, expecting different results. And so currently right now, the students at Yale are working here in West Oakland, looking at a 30-year-old landscape where there was a triple-decker freeway that came down in San Francisco and in Oakland. 30 years later, where the double-decker freeway was in San Francisco, it's probably $1 billion landscape today. Where that same freeway fell in Oakland, it's undervalued. So in 30 years, it hasn't gained any value. And so one asks the question, then why? Well, if you look at the people in the one from Oakland, they're the undervalued people. And so they got a parkway. They built a parkway. In San Francisco, they built a world-class waterfront, right? With art and everything. And so really trying to come up with futures for groups that we haven't before. And so we're using fiction to do that. And it's been really interesting, some of the things that have come up. And it gives students a different way to deal with culture and race and some of the other issues, because you're basically going back in time and finding places of bifurcation. Basically, if we know then what we know now, go back and then bring things forward. And some of the solutions or some of the projects are pretty interesting that the students are coming up with.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that the possibilities of redesigning seems far more rich than just designing, right? We need to adapt to to reinterpret, to reappropriate and readdress things, because the systems that we have are, as you said, they're so gnarled up with all these other political issues and social issues that as objects, they can't be disassociated from those contexts and have to be re-examined and redesigned again.
And I think if we can design with the kind of an advocacy, towards these larger issues. Like I have 10 students, and again, this is a redlined neighborhood in Oakland, which is like most cities. The lowest point in elevation, the flattest, right? We have sewage treatment plant, we have double-decker freeways, we have the railroad. You imagine everything you can imagine to dump in one neighborhood. And so what's been interesting is to see the students go back and find things, ways in to change the politic as well as the economics. One of them is looking at the legalization of marijuana that happened back in the mid-90s. It wasn't the legalization, it was for medicinal purposes. But the idea was if California had moved out 25 years earlier, how much money you could have saved in the penal system, just in incarceration. I mean, it's crazy looking at one zip code and how many people were incarcerated for marijuana. And then looking at how, if you save that money, could you put it into something else? And then if you could then incubate this new economy in this neighborhood, what would it look like?
There's that great project, $1 Million Blocks. Have you seen those?
Oh, yes. Very similar, yep.
That's cool.
So we've been looking at a lot of melds stuff as well. And everything from agriculture, everything to new ecological systems. The students are just questioning these things. And they're arriving at them, again, through a fiction, which takes a lot of the pressure off of them to get it right? And so there are these narratives that are unfolding that hopefully for the students is allowing them to get a view into a more diverse kind of culture and public landscape.
So one of the projects I know that you're working on at the moment is the landscape for the International African American Museum. Could you share a little bit about the backstory of that project and where it's at the moment?
Yeah, the International African American Museum is in Charleston, South Carolina, slated to open 2022. I think it was the design is by Harry Cobb, who passed away last month. We've been working on the project for probably about 4 to 5 years. It's a project that on one level tells the story of the African slave diaspora from Charleston throughout the Northeast as well as the Southern US. Scholars believe close to 40 to 45% of the African diaspora actually landed there. So it's a very important site. The site will have commemorations of the warehouse space that was used to house slaves before sales, as well as try to kind of tell a larger story about the Atlantic crossing. The studio, we've designed a large fountain where we're using the Brooks map, which was a lithograph that really told the story in an infrastructural way of Atlantic crossing. And it showed how slaves were pretty much stacked head to toe, gendered within the hull of the ships. And we're using that as a way of presenting these bodies in space, but also to talk about the hallowedness of the landscape. And so the fountain will basically drain and fill up every hour on the hour. And you can go in the museum and it's a place where you can search for your lineage. So half of it, a large piece of it is a research center. So you can actually go and trace your ancestors here as well as learn about the Low Country.
And what does that the process of that project, how do you deal with that landscape as a designer? How do you sort of go about creating something that recognizes the people who pass through there, but also, has to, I guess you want people to, how do you want people to feel in that space as a designer?
Well, I mean, I want people to feel that they're, occupying hallowed ground. And one big, large discussion we've been having, I say we, the committee, designers working on the project and the artists and the curators, I really wanted the subject not to be somewhat danced around. I really wanted there to be this figurative landscape in which it was very clear that people died at the site and that it was about this quantity, right, of human lives that had and identity. They weren't ambiguous, right? They weren't, they had names. They were from specific places. And I really wanted to do something that was very overt, right? And not kind of hidden. And this is part of a larger, I guess, set of conversations that I think you're beginning to see in the American landscape from a lot of designers of color. Finally, places, whether it's the Lynching Museum, whether it's other commemorative sites, the burial ground in New York, but there are parts of our history that we're beginning to claim. And I think it's important that those people designing them be allowed to have a diverse voices, and that the voices should not be the same. And I started out talking about mythologies, and I do think there's room in our culture for multiple voices to come out as it relates to the history of Africans, African Americans in this country. And there's not one story. That one story is, it's not always going back and getting a kente cloth or, you know, this Afrocentric symbolism. I mean, there are other stories that we can talk about. And one, you know, that for me, I mean, the landscape is sort of full of these kind of mythologies and places that we can begin to sort of talk about the power of water. We can talk about the power that's harnessed in a rock. We can talk about, you know, the stories behind the old oak tree. But those kinds of stories, I think, allow for our culture to be seen as diverse, right? Diverse in its kind of origin as well in the people. So from place to place.
And just to wrap up, I think I'd like to ask you, one thing that's come up again and again in the course of these conversations around Earth Day and design is that people are thinking a lot about non-human animals and how to create spaces as a designer for other non-human animals. There is a sense that our anthropocentric 20th century has caused the 21st century like a lot of damage, and I wondered if that's something that also resonates with you and your work.
Oh yes, oh yes. I would love to let a lot of things just go. No, I mean, I think the world without us, right? I mean, this notion that I started with it sort of slowing things down or speeding things up. When we're out of the way, man, it's like everything's sort of going, you know, to even and level out. And so, I mean, I would love to be able to work on spaces, you know, where I do think that there is opportunities to let some things just go, right? And for us to sort of understand the hybrid, I think when we let things go, we can actually see how the environment would accumulate things in a completely different way. And I think those are the places where I think we can learn about being more resilient, because I do think the future is not about this kind of homogeneity of making these spaces that we can sort of keep the same forever, but it's really about this diversity of things that are different, acting upon one another, making these new things. Because I do think we've created these environments where we don't know what we've created, right? Because we're constantly trying to hold them, right? We're trying to hold them and keep them in place. And I think if we let some of them go, we might understand what's best to grow in a place, what could be more resilient. I watched a beautiful lecture by a couple of horticulturists who was doing, you would love this, they had a garden in the Chelsea garden show, the big show, right? And they went to this island in Greece where there were no trees, no plants, and they found these little, I don't know, these little plants growing in rocks. And they were some of the most resilient plants. They brought them to London, filled it up in this garden show. And it was this beautiful thing. But they were talking about how these plants, nothing else would grow there. But these plants were able to sort of create their own ecology within a place. And it was one of those things that talks about if you let things go and you are more attuned to place, you actually will see things in a completely different way.
Well, I think that's a beautiful note to end our conversation on. Thank you so much, Walter. Super appreciate your time and your reflections today. Well, maybe we'll see each other in person some other
Soon.
time.
Yes.